Okay, so given all of these vulnerabilities, all of these risks, what should we be doing about it? How can we design buildings and communities that are more resistant to damage from storms and wildfires and other disasters? How can we design buildings that will protect occupants from reasonably expected events? How can we create buildings that will maintain livable conditions in the event of power outages or interruptions in fuel or water shortages? So the solutions here apply at both the building scale and the community scale. I'm going to kind of crank through these, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So starting with flooding, this is downtown Brattleboro, our hometown, in September 2011 when Tropical Storm Irene occurred. This is Flat Street, and you can see on the left side of the photo, there's a row of street lights. That's Flat Street, and the retail establishments along it. There's a creek that's hidden by the trees on the right that jumped its bank. And just off this photo to the right is a building called New England Youth Theater. This was a renovated warehouse that was built maybe 10 years ago. And it's an interesting project. I was involved with, helped me make it a little bit greener when it was under construction. And the engineer, when they built it, realized that they were on a floodplain, and it met the FEMA defined flood elevation. It was a foot above the 100-year flood elevation, but they still knew it was vulnerable. So they instituted, a feature of these flood barriers on the exterior entries to the building. These are panels that can fit into permanently installed channels on the exterior entry doors. And I think these provided 20 inches of protection. And before leaving the building that Sunday morning, the building manager deployed these panels. So they're dropped into place, and little turnbuckles tighten them into place. And, again, there wasn't an expectation that flooding would occur, but it was a safety measure. And lo and behold, the Whetstone Brook jumped its bank, and water came up to within 1.5 inches of the top of these flood barriers. So this fairly simple measure, that may have cost several $1,000s to implement on this building, probably saved the building several $100,000 of damage had it been fully flooded, and might have forced the nonprofit to shut down. But anyway, it's a great story of a solution that could have been value engineered out. In other words, taken out during budgeting because it added a little bit extra cost, but they persevered and kept it in, and it paid off big time. I understand that since this storm, they've gone back and added about 4 inches of freeboard to these panels to provide further protection. There are things that we do to provide for increased stormwater flows. This is more at a macro scale or community scale. So this is a photo of culverts where a stream goes under a road in Vermont. This is one that was washed out during Tropical Storm Irene. There was a single culvert here that was smaller diameter. When they replaced it, they replaced a single culvert with 3 culverts that were larger diameter to provide for that increased flow. If there's too much flow for that culvert, the flow quickly overtops the culvert and washes out the road. And that's what happened in hundreds of places around Vermont during that storm. Also on a community scale, we can install modular flood barrier systems. These are fairly common in parts of Europe. The infrastructure for these are permanently in place, and in advance of a storm, fortunately we have pretty good predictive capability now. In advance of a storm, a crew goes in and installs these panels and provides, these temporary walls that protect the buildings inside of those or communities. Also on a macro scale, following Superstorm Sandy, there was a design competition called Rebuild by Design, looking for ideas on how to make the New York City area more resilient. And one of the more interesting ideas that came out of that design competition was by the Bjarke Ingels Group, a Danish firm, to propose a series of berms around all of Lower Manhattan to provide about 10 feet of protection for the whole lower part of Manhattan. There's incredibly valuable real estate here, so this is a situation where it makes sense to protect that from these storm events. So this berm is, not just a wall or like a levee that we might see along the Mississippi River, but it's designed as a landscaped feature that enhances the area from a design standpoint rather than negatively affecting it. So a few quick images of this. This is Lower Manhattan. I believe this is the East River Drive, very vulnerable. And then this is what they imagine to do, to elevate that, create recreational space on that elevated area. In this case, the highway runs underneath this in kind of a tunnel. There are recreational facilities on the right that can be flooded, like tennis courts, but then also recreational amenities on top of this berm. Other images from Bjarke Ingels Group showing these landscaped berms, creating bike paths, creating parkland, really nice features. And this isn't just an idea that sits on a shelf. This is actually now being implemented. The first phases of this are, should be going into construction either at the end of this year or early next year. They've secured the first phases of funding. I think there was a $300 million award that was made to begin this work. So it'll be really exciting to see how this evolves and to see if indeed it does protect Lower Manhattan from the next storm. We can design for extreme wind. This map shows in red the area with greatest risk of tornadoes. The checked area on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast is the area with hurricane vulnerability. So these are FEMA wind zones, zone 3 and 4 in the orange and red, areas where we need to go to, more significant levels in wind design than we do in the western U.S. So, how to do that? We have a lot of experience with structural engineering on designing for hurricanes with hurricane strapping, with tie-down straps, with high-strength roof sheathing. Other features, there are a couple of companies that really specialize in these products, like Simpson Strong Tie, a whole big range of steel systems to make these buildings a lot stronger. This building is the Brock Environmental Center at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, was designed with intense wind in mind. This was one of the first Living Building Challenge buildings to be certified. So it's a net zero energy building. It was also a LEED Platinum building. LEED is the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design program of the U.S. Green Building Council. This is right on the Chesapeake Bay. It's an organization working to protect the bay. So the building is elevated to protect from floodwaters. The roof is designed to deflect wind and survive much higher wind than code requires. You can make out a wind turbine. There are 2 different wind turbines and a large photovoltaic array that provide power for the building to make it net zero energy. But a great example of designing this building as a system. We can also design for power outages, this concept of passive survivability that I referred to earlier. I like to show this house, sort of showing what can be done even in a very extreme climate. This is in northern Quebec, 130 miles north of Quebec City, a climate with over 10,000 heating degree days. Those are Fahrenheit heating degree days, so significantly colder than where I am in Vermont with about 7,000 heating degree days. And, this house is designed with, very high level of insulation. And the reason it is, the owner, Alan Hamill, had lived through two disasters in the 90s. First, the Saguenay flood of 1996 that flooded his home, and then an ice storm in January 98 that, which was Canada's first $2 billion disaster. Atmospheric conditions deposited 3 to 4 inches of freezing rain or ice on buildings and utility lines and everything over a 4-day period. In January of 1998, they lost 130 large power transmission towers, 30,000 utility poles, 4 million homes lost power. 600,000 families were forced from their homes. So Alan Hamill lived through that, and he vowed that if he ever built a new house, it would be resilient. And it so happened some years later, another tragedy resulted in his house burning down. So he rebuilt with a house that, was indeed very resilient. So again, very cold climate. He built this house with R80 walls and foundation walls, R64 floor, R150 roof, but just extraordinary insulation levels. Triple glazed windows throughout with dual low-E coatings, high solar heat gain windows, so they allowed a lot of sunlight through to provide passive solar heating. Very tight construction, tighter than the passive house standard, and a very heavy snow load to prevent damage in the event of intense storms. The house was also built well above the flood level, so would be survivable. I got to know Alan because he took a course that I teach at the Boston Architectural College on resilient design. And when we introduced ourselves, I realized that maybe he should be teaching the course, not me. But a great story on what can be done. So here's the argument on this passive survivability concept. If we look at typical houses, and this is energy modeling of typical residential buildings in New York City with a power outage. So what happens if we lose power? You can see that vertical line called out as blackout on day one. Over a 1-week period, what happens to indoor temperatures in these buildings? And the different color lines here show the different types of homes. A row house on the top, the red line is single family house. In the middle is all glass high-rise buildings. So these are typical buildings built to, average standards, of existing homes today. And you can see that pretty quickly temperatures drop well below the safe level. So somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, if you're in that building, even with a coat or in a sleeping bag, it becomes a dangerous place. So, this is not representing passive survivability. Now, if we do that same energy modeling with energy efficient buildings, buildings built to the modern energy code, that drop in temperature becomes much more gradual. It doesn't cool off nearly as quickly, and you can see it drops only to, 55 degrees, a little lower than 55 degrees with the single family house after a week, given temperatures in the, 10 to 20 degree range. We can do the same kind of modeling in the summer. These are the same sorts of buildings in New York in summer design conditions with very high outdoor temperatures. And you can see here Some of these buildings, the all-glass high-rise building in brown, basically becomes uninhabitable within hours of losing power during the daytime. So very unsafe. Again, these are, with standard homes as they exist today. If we look at the same with energy efficient homes, the increase in temperature is much more gradual. They still do warm up over time given the thermal mass in these buildings, but they generally stay within the safe level, not getting much into the mid-80s. Okay, so I was part of a task force in New York City that looked at how to revise building codes and other regulations following Superstorm Sandy to enhance resilience. And I was really pleased that we were able to push through this recommendation to maintain habitable temperatures without power. So this is in this final report of this Building Resiliency Task Force in June 2013. And it doesn't say how you have to do this, but that you need to, the recommendation is to develop codes that would ensure that buildings are well enough built using passive design features and energy efficiency to maintain these habitable conditions. Now, this recommendation hasn't been implemented, although half of the 32 recommendations that came out of this task force have now been implemented, but at least this one is it's out there. It's in this report, and hopefully with the next disaster that hits New York, there will be further momentum to implement this through more stringent building codes or other regulations. You can have wood heat as a backup. This makes more sense in rural areas. This is an interior photo of our home, which I showed as my very first slide. It's a farmhouse in southern Vermont that we renovated, actually pretty much rebuilt to make it much more energy efficient. It's a net zero energy home, foot thick walls that provide, very high level of energy performance. And but it's all electric. We have solar power, it's a net metered system, but we're all electric except for this little wood stove. And it's the smallest wood stove we could find that still had a glass door for aesthetic reasons. It was so small that we found it looked a lot better if we elevated it on this slate pedestal. But anyway, that's our backup heat during extremely cold weather or if we lose power. And that small wood stove can easily heat the house. The primary heat for the house is a single 18,000 BTU per hour air source heat pump, or mini split as it's often called. Solar electricity, this is our system, this is our barn. Shown here is an 18 kilowatt system, a pretty large system, but it's a group net metered system. This is something we can do in Vermont with our utility company and our regulatory structure. So a neighbor of ours owns a third of this, we own 2/3. And that power is fed into the grid, and then we pull power from the grid, in a net metering arrangement. When we built this, we wanted to put in a full battery system for backup power at night. We couldn't fit that into the budget, but we did at least, this would have been, what that full backup system might have looked like. This is a neighbor's place, another house in Dummerston, Vermont, with these specialized inverters that can pull power off a battery bank, which is shown in the cabinet in the event of a power outage. There are 2 of these 120 volt inverters, so they can use it for a 220 volt or 240 volt pump, water pump, submersible pump. We didn't have the budget for this. That was going to cost an extra $14,000 to implement. But we did find out about these new inverters that were just entering the market. I think we got one of the first half dozen that came into the US from Germany, made by SMA. a German company. And this is an inverter. It's a transformerless inverter that during a power outage, I can do a hard disconnect from the grid, and then we can plug in loads to the outlet beneath the inverter. So it's 120 volt electricity, that can be used to charge cell phones, to power a cable modem and wireless router, even a refrigerator or cooling system, if you had a long enough extension cord. This doesn't feed power into the whole house electrical panel, but at least it provides some backup power during the day when the sun is shining. Again, it's not a system for nighttime lighting or other, full emergency use, but at least it provides us with some access to power during an extended power outage. I'm going to go through a commercial example very quickly, and we're almost ending here. I have maybe another dozen slides. This is a hospital in Boston, in Charlestown, Boston. A new hospital completed about 5 years ago, Spalding Rehabilitation. It's for spinal cord injuries. And they built a new hospital down on the water, Boston Harbor. A lot of their therapies involve water treatment. So they like getting patients out on the water. And this was a beautiful site, but one that they knew was vulnerable to flooding. So they went to pretty significant measures to provide resilience. The building itself is elevated about 30 inches above the 500-year flood line. It's protected by this protective berm against storm surge on the water side. The entire first floor is designed so that it can be flooded with very minimal damage. So there are therapeutic pools on the ground floor. These are, objects that are designed to get wet, so they're not going to be damaged by flood water. There's also a room with equipment, portable equipment that could be moved out of the way, moved to an upper floor in advance of a predicted storm. All of the mechanical equipment is kept out of the floodable areas. It's all elevated. Very significantly, the patient rooms all have operable windows. This building they were just beginning design on it when Hurricane Katrina happened in the Gulf Coast. And in New Orleans, the design team at Perkins and Will saw hospitals that lost power, and they weren't able to evacuate all of the patients. And they saw nursing staff having to use chairs to break windows to get fresh air into these buildings that were in some cases 110 degrees and very high humidity. So they wanted to do something about that. And this is the first modern hospital in America that I'm aware of that was designed with operable windows in all the patient rooms and all common spaces in the hospital. Shown on the left, these windows are key controlled, so nursing staff has access to them. They don't open widely, so there are various security measures built into them, but at least they provide some ventilation. The windows are also all triple glazed. The building envelope is much better insulated than normal to provide for that passive survivability argument. And a great example, the mechanical equipment is all in penthouse floors or on the roof. They had to convince the utility company to let them bring high voltage electricity up through the building in a concrete chase to a utility room that only the utility company has access to on the roof. There are 2 backup generators in the penthouse that either one of which could power the building. Most of the diesel fuel is stored in the basement in a fully bunkerized unit that could be fully submerged and still provide fuel for these generators. There's a small amount of fuel stored on the penthouse floors next to the generators to get them started. Finally, just I want to mention, I'm not going to get into it in any detail, but that resilience is also about, how we get around in communities that might lose gasoline and where we can't drive around. So walkable communities, bikeable communities. We can see in Europe, this is Copenhagen, where bicycling is a way of life, and there are great bikes that are used for cargo, for transporting kids. On the upper right, that photo shows protected bicycle pathways that have the parked cars on the street side of them, and then the walking sidewalks inside of those. So these streets are designed for vehicles, for bicycling, and for pedestrian. And then we can also look at food production and integrating food production into the built environment. This is on the Upper East Side in New York City. Eli Zabar's Vinegar Factory. It's sort of a high-end grocery store, on top of which is 20,000 square feet of greenhouse space. The greenhouses are all heated by waste heat from the bakery next door that Zabar's owns. They provide baked goods to about 1,000 restaurants in New York City. This is another Brooklyn building that has a large greenhouse area on the roof, owned by a company called Gotham Greens. And they're producing 100 tons of greens per year from this. They have power that's provided by a 60 kilowatt photovoltaic array. They're growing using hydroponics, which is lighter weight and able to be supported by the existing roof structure. It's a 15,000 square foot greenhouse built in 2011. Really neat systems. I'll end with just brief mention of some efforts afoot to provide rating systems to ensure that buildings can achieve certain level of resilience. I've worked pretty hard for a number of years on pilot credits for the LEED rating system. These were in place on a trial basis for a year, 2 years ago. 3 credits, one for assessing vulnerabilities, the risks we face. A second credit for designing to enhance resilience given the top 3 vulnerabilities for that area. And then a third credit focused on passive survivability, including thermal resilience and backup power. Those credits were taken down, and the U.S. Green Building Council has since adopted the RELY rating system. And the RELY Steering Committee, which I'm part of, is currently working to integrate the pilot credits into the RELY rating system, and also bring the pilot credits back on their own for projects going through LEED certification. So anyway, watch for some developments both with the LEED pilot credits on resilient design and the RELY rating system over the course of this year and next. So finally, just to summarize, we clearly need to focus on resilience. Given climate change, given other vulnerabilities we're facing, our risks are very real, and we need to protect our families and protect our buildings and our communities. A lot of our resilience strategies, not all of them, but a lot of them, can also be sustainability strategies. So resilience and sustainability can go hand in hand. And what I like about resilience is that it cuts across political boundaries. It's not a red state, blue state issue. Resilience can appeal to everybody. And that strong focus on resilience may be the best way in some parts of the country to kind of back into a more sustainable building system, built environment. This photo, by the way, is another photo of our house with our barn in the background and our Chevy Volt. We're powering pretty much all of our around town driving with excess solar electricity from the solar array. So we're powering our entire house plus our car, plus my mother-in-law's house in Brattleboro. So we're trying to walk the talk and demonstrate how to achieve both sustainability and resilience. Just another final shot of our barn. Thank you very much. And Brett, I'll turn things back to you. Hopefully we've got a little time for some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And yeah, we definitely have some time for questions. And right as those start to come in, I just want to say a big thanks to our board of directors, our volunteers, all of you for attending and allowing us to do what we do. Big thanks to our major sponsor, Shrinergy, for On the Go and In Your House Microgrid Solutions, T-Stud for the world's most efficient wall stud assembly, and Mitsubishi Electric for all your heat pump, small and large HVAC needs. Make sure to check them out. So yeah, one question came in more about if you know of any good maps for tornado risks occurrences, maybe predicting tornado risk occurrences and stronger ones.
Yes, there's a great map that I often put in presentations. I didn't include it here, but it's a map produced by FEMA, I believe, the Federal Energy Management Agency, showing incidents of tornadoes, going back 50 years. So it's a map, showing colored areas where the vulnerability is greatest. And, most of the greatest level of vulnerability is in that tornado belt that I showed in the map that I did include, that FEMA Wind Zone 3. But, it's based on actual data, so it's clear to see that. But I think if you search for tornado occurrence map or something like that, you should be able to find that through Google. If not, you can email me and I can send you that image. It's a quite compelling image.
Mm-hmm. Keeping on that thought about tornado, the question that came in here, is there a building method for single-family roofs that can tolerate tornadoes?
The short answer is no. Tornadoes are, weather events that can result in winds as much as 300 miles an hour, and there's no reasonable way to design homes that achieve that level of protection. There are some exceptions. You could do underground housing, earth-sheltered housing offers greater protection. There are some buildings, emergency management buildings, that are designed to withstand tornadoes. But for most buildings, what we do in tornado risk zones is to design safe rooms, incorporate safe rooms into those buildings. So the assumption here is that the building will be destroyed with a direct hit from a Category 5 tornado, but that people that, occupants that get into that safe room and close the door, there are tornado rated doors, they will be safe. And to my knowledge, there's not a single example of a fatality in even an EF5 tornado from somebody who's been in a safe room. And you can, these safe rooms can be built on site, or they can be, you can buy sort of pre-manufactured safe rooms out of steel, out of composite materials. The site-built ones are typically reinforced concrete, and they're typically anchored to a basement floor slab or a garage slab. In some cases, they're beneath a foundation slab. In cases like that, where the safe room is underground, they often include provisions for lifting debris off the hatch door for that safe room. Because even if you survive the hurricane, if you can't get out of that safe room, you may be out of luck. So there's some, more sophisticated safe rooms that have hydraulic systems to lift pretty significant weight of debris off that access door.
Isn't it, and maybe I just heard, maybe this is a rumor, but isn't it true that homes that are less tight are more susceptible to tornadoes, or leakier homes?
Well, yeah, if a door is left open or allowed to open up in very high wind, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or just a downburst, a very high wind event, if a door is left open or windows are open, you can sometimes suddenly depressurize or pressurize a home and kind of explode the home. But again, in a tornado where you've got 250 or 300 mile an hour wind, a leakiness isn't going to make enough of a difference. That building will likely be destroyed or at least severely damaged.
Thanks. Have you seen any code conflicts that prevent resilient design solutions? Like, so for example, living building challenge requirements are illegal in many places. Anything on the same level for resiliency?
Well, some of the resilience features like, redundant water systems, may not be code compliant. Wastewater or solid waste systems. At our farm, we have a composting outhouse that we can use in the event of a long-term power outage where we don't have water, so we can go out to a composting outhouse. In some areas, you can't get a permit for a composting toilet, given, wastewater and sanitary laws. Yeah, so there are definitely some obstacles. I showed a photo of the Bullitt Center, Living Building Challenge building in Seattle, where they have tried to provide all of the potable water for that building and the landscape irrigation water from water collected off the roof. But it's been a real challenge to, get the city to sign off on that. So they actually have a water connection to the municipal water system. And last I heard, they were, they kind of accepted that was going to have to be there for fire suppression. They were fighting whether they could, rely on their own treated rainwater for potable uses within the building. But that was proving to be a pretty significant challenge. But with resilience, we're often looking at redundant systems. And this is an area where resilience can be in conflict with sustainability. With sustainability, we aim for efficiency, not building any more than needed, not putting in any more systems than are needed. There's embodied energy associated with any system we put into a building. But for redundancy and resilience, we sometimes want multiple systems. So we might want a battery system that has environmental impacts that go along with it and embodied energy that goes along with it. So, in thinking about resilience, we do need to be aware of potential conflicts, both conflicts with building codes and regulations, but also in some cases, conflicts with our sustainability priorities.
Great, yeah, good ideas, thanks. So another question, how would you incorporate a wood stove for resilience without compromising the integrity of your air and thermal control layers in passive homes?
Yeah, so with wood stoves, we have an outdoor air supply to our wood stove. But I should note that our house, which is a early 1800s home that we kind of rebuilt, and we did significant air tightening measures, but did not get it as tight as a passive house standard, the 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. So it's not super tight. It's very tight, but not super tight. In a super tight house, there's, you need greater care for providing makeup air. We have in our kitchen an exhaust hood that vents to the outdoors. A lot of passive houses are using recirculating range hood fans. I didn't want to do that because we make a lot of jam and do a lot of canning in the fall, and I wanted to be able to exhaust the water vapor from cooking in our kitchen. So we accepted a compromise on that. And when we're using that fan, in cooking, we sometimes have to open some windows, but that's something that we know about and can correct. We do have a heat recovery ventilator in our house that runs 24/7 year-round. It's a very high efficiency HRV made by Zender, a Swiss company. Very quiet, and we can boost the mode on that. So we don't have separate exhaust fans in our bathrooms. So if we take a shower, we click the boost button on that, and it boosts the ventilation rate for the whole house for 10 minutes or 30 minutes, and helps to remove that moisture.
I have a question with what's going on in Hawaii now, I guess at the front of my mind. Have you heard of any volcano resiliency strategies?
That's a good question. Actually, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law lived in Volcano on the Big Island for a number of years, and I visited a number of times. And you're very aware of the sulfur dioxide from the continually erupting volcano there, and it's been pretty extreme over the last month. But I think a resilience measure there would be some air quality and filtration measures to try to maintain safe indoor air quality during eruptions, during emissions of sulfur dioxide in the area. And I once remember consulting for somebody, providing technical advice for a woman who lived on the Big Island who had chemical sensitivity, and that was a big issue for her, because she was susceptible to the chemical emissions during these eruption events. As for protection from a lava flow, I think the only protection would be, let's say a tiny house, which has tiny house designs can have some really exciting resilience features, but putting a tiny house on a chassis that's movable. So living in a tiny house, a mobile tiny house, and if you've got a lava flowing your way, you're going to have time to drive it out of the way and move it someplace safer, at least until that threat is gone, and then you can bring it back.
Yeah, thanks. Great thoughts there. We've kind of reached the end here, and I don't see any more specific questions, but can you tell us, I guess, a little bit more about where people can find more information about you, contact you, the Resilient Design Institute, and what kind of resources might be available to them to access?
Sure. The Resilient Design Institute website is easy-to-find, resilientdesign.org, or just do a search for Resilient Design. It should pop up right at the top of the list or close to it. I can be reached either at the info@Resilient Design or alex@resilientdesign.org. So I'm pretty easy to get hold of. Feel free to reach out to me. If you're emailing, you might need to email me a few times. I get a lot of email and sometimes miss messages that come through, but persevere and I'll try to get back to you.
All right, Alex, well, I really appreciate your time, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you, Brett.